Russia and Syria have been under fire for its recent offensive in the Syrian city of Aleppo. Western leaders in the media have been condemning their actions and accusing them of killing scores of civilians. Russia's actions have also been slammed as barbarism. Well, we can cross live now to New York, speak exclusively to Bashar Ja'afari, who's Syria's ambassador to the UN. Thank you very much for coming on to RT this evening. As we were saying there, Aleppo is at the centre of this conflict at the moment. Many accusations coming from the West accusing Syria and Russia too of deliberate bombing of schools and hospitals. What's your reaction to that when you hear those accusations?
Well, thank you very much for having me with you today. First of all, I would like to say that the conflict in Syria is not only about Aleppo. The conflict is covering the whole country, and we should understand the root causes of this conflict in order to give the right assessment. The root causes of this conflict in Syria ravaging the country is due, mainly speaking, to this imposed terrorist war on the Syrians, governments and people as well. And this imposed terrorist war is backed by the Western countries as well as by Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. The mask has fallen, I guess, after 5 years of this ferocious terrorist war against my country. The mask has fallen down, and now everybody knows what's going on in Syria. It's about hundreds of terrorist armed groups, backed, sponsored, given weapons, protected in the Security Council by the same guys who are shedding crocodile tears over the suffering of the Syrian population in Aleppo.
There are many points to talk about, and we'll come on to the broader ones too. I did just want to start with Aleppo because those are the accusations that the Western media and the headlines are all about at the moment. And the accusation is that Syria is deliberately targeting civilians in Aleppo and indiscriminately, and they're also using barrel bombs. I just wanted to get your reaction to those specific allegations.
Well, this is a hypocrite allegation coming from the same governments who are backing the same terrorists we are fighting in Syria. Look, for instance, the American administration claimed and alleged for 2 years that it is combating ISIL in Syria and al-Nusra Front. But be sure, please, that I would like to assure you, that the American campaign called the International Coalition, which is not an international and neither international nor coalition, and I will explain why later. This campaign never targeted al-Nusra Front, for instance, never, ever. The Americans are using, the Americans and the Turks and the French and the British as well, are using al-Nusra Front as a shield to protect what they call the armed moderate groups in Syria. This is in itself an ungenuine move on the side of the American administration, because that proves in itself that the American administration is not genuine and is not serious about combating al-Nusra Front terrorists, which is a terrorist entity according to the Security Council list.
John Kerry just said recently that he wanted the ceasefire to continue to give themselves time to separate rebels from al-Nusra, particularly in Aleppo. Why has this offensive against eastern Aleppo continued? Why did you decide not to listen to John Kerry's proposal to continue the ceasefire there? Because the American officials kept saying and repeating the same thing Kerry said for almost a year and a half. Since Vienna II conference, when the parties, all the parties, including the Russians and the Americans and everybody there, the Iranians, asked entrusted or asked the Jordanian government to come up with a list saying who is terrorist and who is not, and asked the Saudis to come up with another list saying who is opposition and who is not. These two regimes in Riyadh and Amman did not implement their commitments according to the Vienna II conference. Then the non-fulfillment and the non-implementation of these two requirements led to the fiasco of the Geneva talks, intra-Syrian Geneva talks. I am an eyewitness because I'm the head of the Syrian Arab Republic delegation to these intra-Syrian talks. So Kerry and the others, other American officials kept saying and repeating the same thing, that, you know what, we cannot separate these guys from each other right now unless the Russians and the Syrian army stop fighting the Al-Nusra Front and ISIL, then we can maybe separate the other so-called moderate groups, unquote, from them. This is a hypocrite stand, which shows that, as I said at the beginning, Washington and its allies are using the terrorists of Al-Nusra Front and ISIL as a shield to protect the so-called moderate armed opposition groups operating in Syria, of course, backed by the same governments they claim they are fighting them.
OK, I just want to run a quick soundbite that came from the US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power. This is what she said about the recent offensive in Aleppo.
The Russian Federation and the Assad regime have launched an all-out air and ground offensive against eastern Aleppo and its 275,000 civilians. Instead of pursuing peace, Russia and Assad make war. Instead of helping get life-saving aid to civilians, Russia and Assad are bombing the humanitarian convoys, hospitals, and first responders who are trying desperately to keep people alive. Russia, of course, has long had the power to stop this suffering. We know that there can be no peace in Syria if Russia is determined to keep fighting this war.
She talked there about the suffering of civilians in Aleppo. What is the future for them if this offensive continues? How difficult is it to get humanitarian aid to them? How difficult is it to get civilians out of Aleppo?
Well, first of all, I'm afraid the American ambassador to the United Nations is misleading the public opinion by accusing the Syrian government and the Russian governments of targeting civilians. While we all know that in Aleppo, let me say it this way: in Aleppo, there were 4 million people living in Aleppo before the crisis erupted 3 years ago in Aleppo, in the city of Aleppo. 2 million of the population left to the coastal area, meaning Latakia, Tartus, Banias, and all these beautiful cities on the coastal area of Syria. The 2 other millions remained in Aleppo. 1.75 million decided to live in the areas under the government control because they feel safer. 275,000 civilians, unfortunately, are taken hostages by the terrorists of Al-Nusra Front and Jaish al-Fatah and all these terrorist groups changing their labels around the clock, working for the Turkish intelligence, the Saudi intelligence, and the Qatari intelligence, and the American intelligence. So these 275,000 innocent people, civilians, are taken hostages by these terrorist groups and preventing them, and using them, of course, as a human shield, and preventing them from getting out of the eastern part of Aleppo through the 4 humanitarian corridors opened by both the Russians and the Syrian army. So what the American ambassador is saying is a mere allegations and accusations devoid of all accuracy and credibility, because the Americans themselves conducted, according to them, a war against ISIL in Syria a year and a half ago almost. Instead of shrinking the spread of ISIS in the area, the American attack or the American campaign led to the spread of ISIS and ISIL all over the world. So that means in itself that the 67 countries, as the Americans say, who constitute the so-called international alliances, failed to destroy ISIL in Syria, while in 1 year the Russians and the Syrian army dismantled the main important bases, military bases of ISIL on the Syrian soil.
Mr. Ja'afari,
there is a kind of hypocrisy on the ground taken by the, from the American spectrum of the events.
We'll come on to that in a second and look back at what's been achieved since Russia intervened a year ago. But just with respect to Aleppo, it's just the last point I want to make, really. Here's what the UN Under-Secretary General said about humanitarian access to eastern Aleppo. Let's just listen to what they're saying about it.
There has been virtually no humanitarian access through cross-border or cross-line actors since early July. It should be noted that this is as a result of constraints by both the Syrian authorities and non-state armed groups. Furthermore, despite the assertion of there being corridors available, civilians wishing to travel in and out of eastern Aleppo are unable to do so in any significant numbers.
OK, the reason I wanted to play that, just in your opinion, while we have you on here in RT, is there any way you can see of getting humanitarian aid to innocent civilians in Aleppo, and is there any means of getting them out?
First of all, this population in the eastern part of Aleppo are Syrians, and they are dear to our heart. They are our own people, and nobody else would care about them more than the Syrian government itself. This is number one. Number two, the Syrian government is assuming 75% of the humanitarian assistance provided to the Syrians all over the country. And number three, Mr. O'Brien, who is the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, is part of the problem. He is not part of the solution. He is also a big liar when he briefs the members of the Security Council about what's going on in Syria. Because, number one, he is British and he is following his country's agenda against my government. Number two, he knows for sure that these terrorists are taking the civilians hostages in the eastern part of Aleppo based on the reports of the UN staffers working in Aleppo. Let me give you two examples why I am saying that O'Brien is part of the problem. Number one, the former representative of the UNHCR in Syria went to inspect the most important and hospital of ophthalmology in the Middle East, which is located in Aleppo. He went there to see if they are lacking something. This hospital is situated in an area under the control of the terrorists. He went inside and he didn't find out any doctor, any nurses, any medical equipment. He just saw bearded people with weapons occupying this hospital and transforming it into their own headquarters. But this report, Mr. O'Brien is aware of it, but he did not inform the members of the Security Council about it.
Mr. Al Ja'afari,
although there is a report coming from
I just wanted to
let me give you the other example.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask, though, just to get it clear, what can be done to help civilians in Aleppo at the moment? What would the Syrian government like seen to be done? Is there anything that you can propose?
We need to stop the hypocrite approach of the UN OCHA staffers here in the headquarters in New York. These people do something totally different from what they receive as reports from their own staffers on the ground in Syria. So they are falsifying the reports emanating from the ground, from over there. We need to stop this hypocrite approach from some high-level officials of the United Nations. We need to help the Syrian government with genuine humanitarian assistance, not business. We don't need humanitarian business. This is not a bazaar. For the suffering of the Syrian people is not a bazaar for these hypocrite people dealing with this issue this hypocrite way. We need to combat the terrorists, genuinely speaking, in Syria by cooperating with the Syrian government, by consulting with the Syrian government, not by calling the Syrian government the Syrian regime, as the American ambassador keeps saying in the Security Council. It is shameful to see an ambassador of a permanent member talking about a sovereign nation, a leader the way the American ambassador does, or the British ambassador does, or the French ambassador does. These people are in charge of maintaining peace and security in the Security Council, not undermining peace and security and the changing regime by force.
So what conditions would have to be met, in your opinion, what conditions would have to be met for a ceasefire to start again?
We need not only a ceasefire in Aleppo, we need a ceasefire, cessation of hostilities all over Syria. But to do so, you need to block the Turkish government, the border with Turkey, and dictate and impose and obligate the Turkish government to stop the flux of terrorists coming from all over the world through the Turkish-Syrian border. As long as Turkey is sponsoring the terrorist groups operating in the northern part of Syria and coming from all over the world, as I said, they are not Syrians. Most of them are mercenaries and foreigners, according to the Security Council reports. As long as the Turkish government doesn't do that, there will be no solution but the military solution to stop these terrorists.
OK, you said that the only option perhaps could be a military solution. Here's what the US has said it could do if the ceasefire fails.
I said as long, no.
I'm sorry.
No, I said as long as Washington and Ankara and Riyadh and Israel and France and Britain do not stop the flux of terrorists coming and mercenaries coming from all over the world through our common border with Turkey, there will be no possibility to help the civilians, neither in Aleppo nor in anywhere else. The Syrian government cannot do everything on its own. We need a genuine contribution and a genuine participation from these governments hostile to the Syrian government.
Okay.
They are not honest brokers of any cessation of hostilities, and they are not honest brokers in sending any humanitarian assistance.
OK, now obviously there's great concern on all sides that things can escalate from here on. This is what the US said would be its plan B if the ceasefire fails, and we previously heard from top American and Saudi diplomats about this. Here's what they've been saying.
Assad himself is going to have to make some real decisions about the formation of a transitional governance process that's real. If there isn't, as you've read in the newspapers and are probably hearing, there are certainly Plan B options being considered.
We believe that we should have moved to Plan B a long time ago. It was made very clear that Bashar al-Assad has two choices. Either he can be removed through a political process or he will be removed by force.
When you hear that, what's your reaction that they believe that Bashar al-Assad should be moved by force if necessary?
Well, this is a dirty game undertaken by some American officials. Number one, they are personalizing the conflict in Syria by saying that, by talking about the Syrian president the way they do. In an impolite way. Although Damascus knows that Washington is backing the terrorists in Syria, we never say the American regime, we never say that everything is Obama's mistake. This is a very sarcastic and simplified approach. People who are smart wouldn't buy it. This is number one. Number two, the United States never had a plan A to move to plan B. Washington has had always a plan B. They never worked out any plan A. The proof is that we went to Geneva for the intra-Syrian talks, as I told you, to find in front of us terrorists from Jaish al-Ahrar and Jaish al-Islam, both working for the intelligence of Turkey and Saudi Arabia. We kept telling the Mistura and everybody over there, these guys are terrorists, you cannot invite them. The Russians did the same. They talked to everybody, you cannot invite these guys from Jaish al-Islam and Jaish al-Ahrar because they are terrorists. They are working for the Takfiris. They are working for the Salafis. They are working for ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda mainly speaking. But nobody listened. And then you know what? At the end of the day, in the last days of our intra-Syrian talks in Geneva, everybody discovered and agreed with us that, you know what, you were right, these guys are terrorists. And then they let them go and leave Geneva without being part of these intra-Syrian talks. But what was the outcome? The outcome was that we wasted almost a month of negotiation, of dialogue, intra-Syrian dialogue among ourselves, just because of this handicap created by the same guys who claim and allege that they are seeking a peaceful settlement of the so-called Syrian crisis. The crisis in Syria is a rather geopolitical one. It is not a political one. It's not about a humanitarian issue. It is not about combating terrorism. It's about everything. It's about geopolitical ambition linked to the gazoduct of Qatar plan to cross Europe through Turkey in 2009, and it was refused by President Assad. So please, we don't need to simplify things. The conflict in Syria is rather has a geopolitical dimension. And this is what Moscow got from the beginning. This is what Beijing got from the beginning. This is what Tehran got from the beginning. The issue is much, much bigger than what the American ambassador tried to say in the Security Council, or Mr. O'Brien tried to say it, or Mr. de Mistura himself, who is victim of all this machination and manipulation by the influential guys.
As things stand, how do you see the hope of finding a political solution? From where many people are at the moment, it seems it's going further and further away at a rapid pace. Perhaps only 1 or 2% the chances. How do you rate the chances of finding a political solution here right now?
We are, as Syrian government, keen interest in pushing ahead the political settlement, but based on principles. Number one, the settlement should be Syrian settlement. It should be political. It should be without any foreign interference. It should be with the participation of national opposition representatives, not terrorists. We don't need al-Nusra Front to negotiate with us. We don't need ISIL to be part of this, of deciding the future of Syria. We don't need Jaysh al-Islam and Jaysh al-Ahrar and Jaysh al-Fatah, who are simply terrorists working for foreign agendas, to be part of building the future of Syria. The future of Syria should be built up by the Syrians themselves, away from foreign agendas. Syria will never be Iraq. Syria will never be another Libya. This should be understood by everybody, by all those people and governments and regimes who are supporting the terrorist groups in Syria. We will not allow these governments to transform Syria into another Iraq or into another Libya. We are fed up with this foreign intervention into our domestic affairs, and we will not tolerate any foreign interference into our domestic affairs. We are ready to go ahead with the political settlement the way we did it many times during 5 years. We went to Geneva, we went to Moscow, we went to everywhere to find out a political settlement. But based on the principles I have just enumerated, we need, and this is according to Geneva I communique, by the way, and this is according to all the 16 Security Council resolutions adopted on the Syrian crisis, by the way. So I am not departing from the vacuum. I am departing from legal basis acknowledged as so by 16 Security Council resolutions, as well as by the Vienna II Declaration and Geneva I communique. So people should understand that this hypocrisy cannot go ahead for too long. Enough is enough. We need a genuine so-called international coalition to combat the terrorists with the Syrian government, not on behalf of the Syrian government, not to replace the Syrian government, not to ignore the Syrian government, not to bomb bridges, not to bomb a Syrian military position in Deir Zor, not to bomb a school for deaf children in Raqqa, not to bomb the city of Manbij in Aleppo and kill 200 civilians by the French aviation, military fighter jets. Not to kill thousands of Syrians by the Turkish bombardment of the border. Please, we have a message to deliver to everybody. Enough is enough. The Syrian blood is not about making business. The Syrian blood is precious, and the Syrian government is, mainly speaking, in charge of protecting its own population. We are protecting our country. We are protecting our own people and our own population wherever they are. And we have the full right to free Aleppo from the terrorists, to free Homs from the terrorists, to free Damascus from the terrorists.
Okay.
It's our main constitutional
I understand your
rights.
points. And one thing you said there that I wanted to talk about further is the fact that you hope for a political solution to this and allow Syrians themselves to choose who should lead the country. How much support does Bashar al-Assad have from the Syrian people?
He has a lot of support. If the majority of the Syrians wouldn't be with the Syrian president, he wouldn't be able to continue. I mean, we have too many proofs in all over the world as examples, but we have proofs in Syria itself. You know what? Many reports, many surveys were done by the CIA as well as by the Qataris and the Saudis, confidential surveys. And they woke up at the end of the day by saying, you know what, we were wrong. 70% of the Syrian people support President Assad. Another report said 80%. It's a CIA report done in 2013, in the worst moment of the Syrian crisis history. So, after all, it's about a legal president, a legitimate president, legally elected by his own people. Let the Syrians decide who should rule over them. But that should be done without foreign interference. We will not change our president because Washington doesn't like him, or because Paris doesn't like him, or because the Turks don't like him, or the Saudis or the Qataris. Should I change the American president because I don't like him? Should we create moderate armed opposition in America to create a mess and a chaos in America, and claim that we are helping American moderate opposition to to topple the American administration?
I certainly take your point,
I mean, this is wrong. The approach is wrong.
We're running out of time, so I just wanted to ask you two more things, really. With regards to Aleppo, there are reports that the Syrian government is preparing for a major ground offensive there. Is this true? What's the situation? What can you tell us?
With regard what?
With regard, to Aleppo and reports that the Syrian army might be about to launch a major ground offensive there.
No, we are launching an offensive. We will not launch an offensive. We are already launching an offensive to free the 250,000 civilians taken hostages by these terrorists of Al-Nusra Front in the eastern part of Aleppo. Sorry?
With ground troops. You're using ground troops as part of this major offensive.
No, I told you, my friend, from the beginning, we are determined to free every single inch in Aleppo and surrounding, in the suburbs of Aleppo or in the areas surrounding Aleppo. This is not, this is our obligation, constitutional obligation. But we are fighting the terrorists of Al-Nusra Front in the eastern part of Aleppo. We are fighting the same people who said when the Russian-American agreement was declared, they said publicly that they will topple the Russian-American agreement, and they did by bombing the humanitarian convoy. And the Americans, hypocritically speaking, as they always say, you know what they said in the Security Council, and I was there. They said, we made a mistake by bombing the Syrian military position in Deir ez-Zor, and the Russians made another mistake by bombing the humanitarian convoy. So you see how they simplify things? They killed 83 of our soldiers and wounded over 100. And then they destroyed, by backing these terrorists who bombed the humanitarian convoy, they say that the Russians did it. And one mistake is for another mistake.
Would you accept, they have apologised, do you accept their apology?
They did not apologize. They said, we made a mistake. We haven't heard the word, we apologize. So far, we haven't heard it. And it is not enough. They should assume the consequences of their aggressive act. We have 83 soldiers dead due by virtue of what they did in Deir ez-Zor. And they never stopped. Yesterday morning, they bombed 2 bridges, civilians, linking the 2 banks of the Euphrates rivers in the city of Deir ez-Zor. They keep repeating the same mistakes every time, you know. They kill and they say, you know what, we made a mistake.
OK, look, and finally...
Every time they do
I'm sorry to interrupt again. I just wanted to ask one last thing, because we're running out of time, Mr. Al-Ja'afari. But look, if no political solution is found soon, what do you fear for your country?
As I told you, the picture is very clear to everybody nowadays. People are smart. They are not stupid. They are not dumbs. People know that to achieve a political settlement in Syria, Washington and its allies, the Arabs and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, should stop using terrorism as a political weapon. These governments are using terrorism as a political weapon to exert pressure on the Syrian government. And they said it many times. Kerry said it, Obama said it, all the American officials said it, in the Security Council they said it. You know what? They said either President Assad steps down or the war will continue. What does that mean? That means they are behind the war. They are backing the continuation of the war, unless and until President Assad steps down. This is a reality. This is what it is. As far as the Syrian government, we are in favor of political settlement. But we will never tolerate any foreign interference into our domestic affairs. We will not sit with terrorists to decide for the future of our country. Otherwise, you know what? You will see the same guys that you saw in Afghanistan and elsewhere, Boko Haram and ISIL, being partners in ruling over the Syrian affairs. Would you tolerate that? Would any smart guy all over the world would tolerate that? Seeing ISIL, Al-Nusra Front, Boko Haram, and Taliban and Al-Qaeda ruling over Syria, which is the only secular Arab government right now in the Arab world? I mean, please, we need to ask ourselves these genuine questions. It is not about a president and a government killing their own people. This is wrong. This is hypocrite. This is a big lie. A government responsible, such as the Syrian government, wouldn't kill its own people. What would be the benefit for us to kill our own population? Give me an answer.
Mr. Al-Ja'afari, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on to RT. Really appreciated you talking to us at length this evening. That was Bashar Al-Ja'afari, who is Syria's ambassador.